Oh God, as we gather in your name for this, we are grateful. What we pray is for a number of things. One, that we would learn together today. And so we give you this time. We give you our minds, our conversations. We're mindful of those things that we touch that are in here, inside of this place, and then in this community, and even the things around the world. We do want to lift those to you. And we're concerned about a number of things inside of our community, and we pray for those also in our world. And we're thankful for your grace and mercy. And for that, we're humbled and we're in awe of your love and care for us. So be with us during this time, and we offer ourselves to you in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay, for our real serious note takers, if I'm off, you let me know. But I think we ended somewhere in the paragraph that has to deal with verse 29 and verse 34. Is that accurate? Of chapter 1. We got past that? All right, so we went past that, all right? 51's even better. I like it. So, I mean, hey, no need to, it's not a remedial class, so we're good. So we did finish 51. So we talked about the different expectations of the first followers of Jesus, about some looking for Messiah, anointed one, some seeing Jesus as culmination of Mosaic law and prophets. Did we talk about Son of God and Son of Man? All right, perfect. All right, good deal. So now we're into chapter 2. So excellent. You guys are, we can't tell this to the Friday morning group, but y'all were way ahead of them. So, I mean, what's that? Well, you want to consider the source there. So, I mean, the male ego is very fragile. And so, there's a level of, we have to be real gentle with our Friday brothers, right? All right, so they are a little bit of they're close to where y'all are at. We'll probably catch y'all maybe by Friday. So we're in chapter 2, and so we leave. Just kind of to think again, since we didn't meet last week because of the election, you've got the first 18 verses of the Gospel of John, and John, the Gospel writer, starts very broad and brings in a number of theological concepts in relationship to Jesus, and that are in relationship to this one. We don't know it's Jesus until we get past verse 18, but he funnels that all the way down to this one person, Jesus, and then he gives testimony to those. And so everything that he's talked about in the first 18 verses, what we'll discover is that John will give evidences for everything that is talked about in those first 18 verses. And obviously he starts with John the Baptist, and so you get insight into John the Baptist, you get insight into John the Baptist's witness, and then you move even broader still to then some of the first followers of Jesus. Some of those are people that are connected to John the Baptist, some are not. But then we move to chapter 2. We leave these first witnesses, and we get into some different types of examples or evidences of verses 1 through 18 of chapter 1. And so we have what we know as the wedding at Cana. And if somebody would read for us verses 1, this is chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And so we'll talk about the wedding of Cana. One through 12. Is that it? Did someone actually say Betty? Fantastic. All right. Yeah. So that's wonderful. Are you sure you're the right Betty? I mean, it's just good, yeah. So.
On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars of the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." This, the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed in Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days.
All right. Okay, good. Thank you, Betty. And we'll be happy for you to read here in a little bit more, too. So just...
Somebody else.
Yeah. All right. So the wedding at Cana. What do you think of whenever you hear the wedding of Cana? Water into wine. Outside of this Bible study on the Gospel of John, whenever you hear the wedding of Cana, what do you think about? First miracle. All right. Well, you're just a bunch of Bible thumpers, huh? How about weddings in general? What's that? Sure. Well, I mean, we know that. Inside the wedding liturgy, it's in the very beginning. Dear beloved, we're gathered here in the sight of God in the presence of these witnesses, joined together, this man, this woman, holy matrimony, which is an honorable state, institute of God, signifying unto us the mystical union which exists between Christ and His church. Right? Do what? The meaningful part? Yeah. So, and then it says, which Christ adorned and beautified with His presence in Cana of Galilee. All right? Okay. So most of y'all probably not paying attention. Y'all just looking at the bride and the dress and the groom. I mean, which is fine. I mean, I'd be doing the same thing. On one level, this passage has nothing to do with Jesus blessing the institution of marriage, when we put it in the liturgy, and which is interesting because often, what's that? That's exactly right. He's just there, and so when some people study this particular passage on the wedding of Cana, it actually, we start to follow down a number of rabbit trails. And for someone like me, I enjoy that, right? And so we'll talk about the wedding of Cana and how this is in some form or fashion a statement about the institution of marriage. And or it becomes, did Jesus actually drink wine? And, what does that have to do with wine? Was it fermented? Was it not fermented? And, all those, there's all kind of rabbit trails. And so seeing how that y'all love to follow rabbit trails, let's walk down a few and see what happens.
And everybody wondered, why was this his first
Right.
miracle?
And
Well, our Sunday school teacher, Sherry Evans, says his mother told him to.
well, we're going to get to that in just a second because his conversation with his mother is actually, let's just kind of, hang on, let's hold on to that one. Great point, but let's just hold on to that for just a second. This is not, there are other passages that talk about weddings and marriages and the institution of marriage. I'm not sure this is one of them. Now, he is there, and he's a witness, and he's part of it, which meant that he just would have been invited. The way we do engagements and then weddings are a little bit different than it took place in the ancient world. Basically, what would happen is this is still at a time where the status of women is assigned to some relationship to a person, to a man, and it'd be either dad first or what would be husband second. And then if neither of those, then it would be older son, then next oldest on down the line. Y'all know the story of Ruth. what puts Naomi in such a place where she is fearful, bitter, you name it, is because she has no status now. No, dad has already died. We assume that because she's been married to her husband for a while. Husband dies, both sons die. So she in that society, and thankfully we're not in that same society today, that society then would push her to the fringes. Okay? So, and even in Jesus' day, what would happen, there's a wonderful passage in Luke where Jesus is walking, he's coming into the town as the funeral's going out of the town. And he stops and he touches the son who's dead. And he says he gives her her son back to her mother. It's actually two miracles in one. The healing of the son, but then also the healing of the mother, because she would have been, she'd been pushed to the fringes of society. So Luke is doing a play on words in that particular passage. But the way marriages worked in that day is that a family, or at least what would be the groom, goes to normally the dad and would work out some level of a bride price for the daughter. And that would be arranged, that would be paid, and then it was the groom's responsibility to go and to build a house, actually build on to his father's house. Our day and time is it's fairly, we're living in a day and time when the idea of people get married and they live in their own house or in their own apartment or whatever, that's relatively new. That's when compared to the history of it all. In this particular day, the groom would build on a room, and when that, or some level, maybe another level, the homes went up instead of out back then. And then when that was completed, he would go with his family to go get his bride. And so it wouldn't be one of those things where they would send out invitations that said, save the date, like 18 months in advance or whatever, a year in advance. And then, what is it? Was it 6 weeks, 8 weeks? When do you actually mail out the wedding invitations? 6 weeks out. There was none of that. Just when it was ready, here he went. And so the parable that has to deal with in the Synoptic Gospels about the 10 virgins with the oil, and some of them run out, and so the idea is that they missed the coming of the groom. So that's some significance behind all that. Well, but whenever it was ready, go and get the daughter, have the wedding, and then they would all be welcomed back to the groom's side of the family, normally their town, their house. And so it's a little bit different than what it is today. So Jesus, in some form or fashion, either through Mary or through Jesus' family, would have some level of connection with the people in the wedding, because they would have been invited to come and to witness and to participate. Now, whether or not that is a endorsement from Jesus for the honor and what we say in the wedding liturgy, probably not. But it sounds good, and so we like it when it's in the. We like it in the wedding service. But there are other passages in the Bible that actually talk about the institution of marriage. This is an indirect at best. So Jesus is at this wedding, and it does involve wine, and so it's funny. You can get out 10 different commentaries on, was it fermented wine? Even if it wasn't fermented wine, maybe it was sort of like a half fermentation, and maybe Jesus turned the water into wine, and either it wasn't fermented or it was fermented, but he didn't drink it, and then he didn't, that's one question. Isn't it important? My take would be is that Jesus drank the wine. And that since, one of the things that shows up inside the larger scope of the Gospels is normally what happened at weddings. People got drunk. I mean, it talks about drunkenness, and over indulging on that. So whether or not Jesus did that, or participated, or stood to the side and just watched it, we don't know. Now the odds on Jesus losing control and whatnot, probably. I mean, that's a stretch as well. But just as much as the stretch would be that Jesus did not participate in any of the normal customs of that day. I just think that's where we read into the text what we want the text to mean and to say, and that's just that's a question that I'm not sure John is even concerned with. So, if that hurts you or helps you, well, and the water was not. It's not like. And again, they didn't have soft drinks, and and water was sketchy at best, and so wine was actually a drink that was a drink of safety, and there were degrees of fermentation. Now, okay, so that there is some of that goes on in the ancient world. Marty, to your credit, not you specifically, but to the credit of the text, there is something that takes place where they're drinking some quality of wine, and whatever Jesus creates, it is of better quality. Now, does that mean they were drinking a $5 bottle of wine, and then he brought out a $100 bottle of wine? Somebody else can determine that. I don't think John, the gospel writer, is even concerned with it. Okay? And that's my point. Just like we want to say, oh, Jesus is at the wedding, he's blessing the institution of marriage. We might be reading into the text what we want the text to say. Whether or not Jesus is, this is non-fermented or fermented, or whether or not it's, Jesus partaking or not partaking, the text is not concerned with it. What the text says is that in some form or fashion, probably a relative of Mary's is about to be embarrassed because they're about to run out of wine. It'd be like you inviting people to a reception, maybe for your children or your grandchildren, and when everybody shows up, you do the number real quick and you realize you're not going to have any food. Yeah, it's exactly right. Oh, would be the appropriate saying. And so what you have then is Mary who goes to Jesus. Now, Jesus has not performed any miracles yet, at least in the Gospel of John. And so how did she know to go to him? Was it, you got the Luke passages of the whole birth, the birth stories that show up with Mary. She's treasuring these things in her heart. Whether or not she had witnessed Jesus performing any miracles or not, we don't know. It could be something to where she is, on one level, she has witnessed that. Again, we're speculating, we don't know. Or, by this time Jesus is an adult. And so she might have just learned to trust his judgment or whatever it may be. Again, we don't know what those answers are, but we do know that the host of the party is about to be in trouble, and that would be a major communal embarrassment. And so it's not just, I invite Becky's family over to eat, and then, Becky calls at the last minute and says, can I bring Ruth's family as well? And, I don't have enough food. No, this would be a major embarrassment. This would be, I invited you all over to my house, and all we have is crackers. So it'd be, it'd be one of those deals. So Mary goes to Jesus and says, do something, right? Yeah. Right. Well, when the wine ran out, so we do know in verse 3 that there was wine first. All right, so the wine ran out. The mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. as is to say it ran out, or about to run out, or what have you. They've served the last little bit. And Jesus said to her, so we don't know, there's an expectation that comes with they have no wine. All right, now again, we don't know what it is. So one of the things that we can ask of the text is, what did Mary expect Jesus to do?
I think you're overlooking the importance of the oldest son to a woman that has no husband. You don't understand, like, he was
Sure.
an important person in her life, and especially the only one of their relatives, so she would just go to him.
Well, there would have been, we're assuming that she's tied to some level of the host family. Right. Well, but it would be, she's not responsible for them running out of wine, okay? But obviously there would be a level of concern for the host family, which would make us conclude a couple of things. One, either Mary is just concerned about anybody being embarrassed, okay? Or that this might be some level of connection to Mary, maybe through family origin. And so there's a little bit of ownership that even though this is not her specific family's wedding, it would be, my second cousin is hosting this, and I have some level of affinity with them, so I am concerned.
But if you put you and your mother in the same situation, and it was her second cousin or whatever, and she saw that happening, would she not come to you?
Sure. Well, and Jesus would be first, all right? Now, even though it's not mentioned, we have a pretty safe assumption there are other brothers now, okay? And that Joseph probably has exited in some form or fashion. But she does go to Jesus, and she does state the facts. They have no wine. But we don't know 100% what her expectation would be, probably other than you got to do something. Would that be safe?
She also says, she tells the servants to do whatever.
Right. We haven't gotten, so there's a level of trusting.
They could have said, go to 7-Eleven.
Could have been. Right. Right.
And we're not there yet, but because she tells those people to go and do what he says, there's some acknowledgement on her part that he has power.
Yeah, all right. And so the question is, Mary does go to Jesus, says they have no wine, right? Which would probably be either she got up and went and said, we got a problem, they have no wine, or leaned over and said, I don't know if you know this, but they have no wine. So Mary goes to Jesus with the statement of fact. What does Jesus say to Mary? All right, let me ask it to you this way. Yeah. Woman, what does this have to do with me? Is this disrespectful?
No, it sounds it is something.
Yeah. The title of woman is not disrespectful by any stretch, and in that particular day. Now it might be a little disrespectful today. I tell you what. Sometime in the future, I'll give this response if y'all ask me a question, and then tell me if it's disrespectful. So this would feel I could hear my grandmother behind me going, oh, this would have led to a switch in Shane having a date growing up. I'll just tell you, if I would have said, woman, what does that have to do with me? But so we do have this Jesus' answer to Mary that sounds like rebuke. Statement after that, woman, what does this have to do with me? That's verse 4. And then right at the very end of 4b, what does Jesus say? My hour has not yet come, which is a boundary defining statement. All right, which means we get rationale for why he responded the way he did. Again, it's not disrespectful in the way that he responded, but coming out of that response is, this isn't my issue right now. Which is interesting.
See, I don't think about him saying this isn't my issue. This is just not the time for
Well, same thing. Okay, all right. So,
I'm not meaning the issue of the wine. I'm just thinking, he's thinking, this isn't where I want to make my debut.
well, all right,
Say it.
but well, I mean, what I mean, not my issue at this time is there's something larger at play for Jesus that either Mary did or did not see. We don't know.
Well, Mary said, do whatever he said, so she took the reins back.
Yeah, well, and her response is do whatever he tells you, and which means she's talking to someone else, probably the servants at that time. But what's that response, I would argue, is not a response of Mary knowing fully how it's going to play out. And so it's, whether she's witnessed Jesus do miracles previously, or he's the firstborn, so he's the fix-it person for the family, or she's learned to trust his judgment through previous experiences. Again, we don't know any of those. We're just speculating. But all of those would yield a response that says, well, whatever he says to do, just do it. But I would argue she really is not dialed into whatever he's going to do. And that at least in the beginning, her desire for him to fix it is at least some level, not opposition, but it's on a different path than at least what Jesus is, as he perceives his path would be, whether it be debut or whatever terms we want to put to it. What Jesus has in mind for what's going to happen and what Mary has in mind for what she wants to happen probably aren't 100% on the same level. And so he defines himself to some degree a little bit differently from just getting up and doing it. Mary exits that conversation with the idea of, well, whatever it is, I'm just going to trust you to do it. So then Jesus, there are 6 stone waters. Those are, now you can, there's a whole level of conversation and teaching around these 6 stone water. Those were the pots that were used to clean, the ceremonial pots. And so Jesus takes those. Now, whether or not that is Jesus superseding the ceremonial law, again, that the text doesn't tell us. But there's a whole level of conversation that people like to take this particular text and say, well, Jesus took these pots that stood for ceremonial washing, ceremonial cleansing, and he transforms them into something else. And so then they conclude that this is a getting rid of this whole ceremonial aspect, and now he's replacing that. That's that's a wonderful conversation and debate. Again, I'm just not sure John, the gospel writer, is trying to do that. Just like Jesus being at the wedding is a stamp of approval for the institution of marriage because Jesus was there. I'm not sure there are other passages that address those things. I'm just not sure it shows up here in John 2. But Jesus, and if it is, that's okay. Because it would be, when we get into the rest of the gospel, and then we look at the larger scope of the New Testament, we do see that Jesus does some things that take what was going on in the Old Testament to a different level. All right? The next passage that we deal with is Jesus in the temple. And so there's theological implications there. So whether or not this is with ceremonial law, I don't know. If it is, it's very, very, very indirect, and it probably creates more questions than it does answer them. But what Jesus does do, he takes those pots, and it's a number of gallons, and he tells the servants to fill the jars with water, and they fill them up to the brim. And then he says, draw some water out and take it to the master of the feast. They did do that. The master of the feast tastes the water. Now it has become wine, and they did not know where it came from. And then there is this qualitative. So you've got this you've got quantity and quality that shows up in this passage. Obviously, John, the gospel writer, at least gives us some clarifying information about how much wine is being created. All right, and it's a lot. It's a vast amount. Do what? Oh, it's abundance. So the quantity is an abundance. And then it's not just quantity, it's quality. Because when the water, either it's changed the wine inside the jars, or from the time it gets from the servant scooping it out and giving it to the master of the feast, and he drinks it, there's some level of change. And it's a qualitative change as well. So you have both quantity and quality that shows up inside of this passage. Does that make sense? All at the hands of Jesus. It's a lot of wine. How many bottles is that? I mean, by today, who knows? A lot. And but we do have quantity and quality that shows up. But what is interesting in this passage is particularly that comment with "my time has not yet come." And so what Jesus is defining, and will continue to define throughout the rest of the gospel, is that everything that he does or is doing, depending on what tense, if we're looking at it as if it's real time, is submitting to the Father's will. And that's a big theme that shows up in John's gospel. Jesus established firmly at the very start of his public ministry, and that's what this is. This is the start of his public ministry. At the very beginning, he is establishing, or at least John, the gospel writer, is painting a picture that Jesus is establishing. The course of his ministry will be shaped by the final goal of what it hopes to accomplish as directed by the Father's will and not human preference. And so, you see this at the very beginning. This is, this is from the very beginning establishing who's going to call the shots. And it will be directed by Jesus being obedient to the will of the Father. And that theme never goes away. The very beginning. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was what? With God and was God. And so that is the idea that Jesus operates, acts, speaks, thinks. All those things get explained inside John's gospel, that Jesus does everything in accordance to the will of the Father. When we get into John 14, from 14 on, he talks about the words I speak, they come from the Father. The actions I commit, they are directed by the Father. I and the Father are one. That never goes away. Actually, when you read those passages in John 14, 15, 16, that whole upper room experience, and then when you have that what we call the high priestly prayer, or the prayer that he prays for his disciples, it's all these restatements. I and the Father are one. I say the words that he get. All that. In John's gospel, where it talks about the shepherd, the sheep know the voice of the shepherd. So it's all this play with words and all of it. Even now, the very beginning, what's being dictated by Jesus is that his actions will be dictated, will be directed by the will of his Father. Now, to Sherry's credit, he did do what his mother asked him to do, which means that he's a good boy, and so he does solve the problem. And Mary did not challenge him, nor did she ignore whatever level of rebuke. But she just says, almost the same level of faith that shows up in the Gospel of Luke. Do unto me according to your will. Whatever he says, we're going to do it. And what's the net effect of that is both quality and quantity when it comes to the wine, which is interesting. And it's interesting that John's gospel starts Jesus' public ministry here. Now, think back to John arranges his gospel not in a chronological fashion the way that the synoptics do. Synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Theirs are more chronological in base. John's gospel is a little bit different. It's more thematically based. And so he begins his ministry with the wedding of Cana. And then immediately we go into this next passage that has to do with the cleansing of the temple. So if somebody through 17, we're going to break this up in a couple of pieces. All right.
When it's almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and the temple courts had found an entrance
All right, so we have, if you can imagine, and this is not, give me some latitude on the drawing, okay? So this is, if you can imagine this being Jerusalem, all right, and it's not a rectangle, but it'll work out for us today. The temple was a very large structure and sort of anchored one of the, not a side of a rectangle, but it sort of anchored a level of real close to the wall, or one aspect of the wall in Jerusalem, and so you've got the temple here, and the temple's made up of courts, and there are a handful of them. The largest, when it came to square footage, would be the court of the Gentiles, and then you would have the court of the women, and then you had the court of the men. And then you had the priest area, and then of course you had the Holy of Holies. And entrance, you could enter into whatever degree of the temple as given by the court. So Gentiles and Jew could go into the court of the Gentiles. And then you've got the men and women, Jewish men and women could go into the court of the women. And then you had the court of the men or the Israelites, and women couldn't go there. And then you had the priest, and only priests could go in there. And then, of course, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies only a certain time during the year. And what is going on is that there are inside a certain part of the temple, there are all these stations set up for what I think the text says, what, money changers or not money changers? What else? Anything else? Yeah, I don't. It says money changers, but we'll also set up are those selling oxen, sheep, pigeons, and the money changers that are sitting there. And so Jesus, during the Passover, which would have involved the temple, in some form or fashion. That when Jesus enters in, and there were a couple of different places you could enter in, he witnesses inside the court of the Gentiles all these different things, whether it be money changers, whether it be people selling oxen, selling sheep, selling pigeons, money changers, and whatever he witnesses, he does not like. Correct? Is that a pretty fair assessment? And so he makes a whip out of cords, and he drove them all out of the temple. And so we have to figure out what all means. With the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. So what got Jesus so upset? Making money in the temple. Okay, so we've got either making money. So obviously he didn't like capitalism, right? So I'm just kidding. So, all right, making money, messed up the worship. Is that what you said, Mary Lou? Something like that?
Oh, well, it says in here, it turned the temple into a market.
Yeah, all right. So temple is market. All right. Let's see, anything else?
He turned over the table.
Yeah, so he turns over the tables. And that could be same thing. Didn't like what he saw with either people making money or temple. What's that?
He just was doing it all.
Yeah, I mean, what he did at one time was he got rid of all this. All right. So what I was asking is why did he get rid of all that? And either making money or temple has changed into market.
They were selling these animals to sacrifice.
Right. That's right. What was said was that the animals were being sold so that people could sacrifice. All right, and that was common. All right, and so it's not just on this particular day. There were places because you had to, depending on what you were sacrificing. Remember, we talked about the Lamb of God back in chapter 1. There's a whole prescription in the Old Testament for sacrifices. Certain sacrifices involved bulls. Certain sacrifices involved birds. Certain sacrifices you could sacrifice that involved grain. And so there's a whole prescription for sacrifices as outlined in the Old Testament. And so what you couldn't do, and again, worship in this day and time was not like us on Sunday morning, where you walk up, and you sit down or stand, whatever it may be, whatever posture, and there's music, and then there's a formal prayer, and there may be some things that you say, and then there's someone speaking, and then maybe communion or something. That's not worship in the Old Testament. Or worship in the New Testament. Worship in the New Testament would have been like worship in the Old Testament, which was tied to sacrifice. And there were these major feasts throughout the year. You didn't worship weekly in the Old Testament. Yeah, I mean that's new. You worshiped at the feasts, and there were 7 of them throughout the year. And normally that meant that you had to go to certain places, whether it be to the temple, or if you were too far away, to a synagogue, which would have been the local place. And now you might go for prayers all the time, but you didn't go to worship like what we would do. Worship was tied to these feasts, and you went for a week, maybe 10 days at a time, depending on how long it took to get there, as prescribed by whatever season for those feasts in the Old Testament. But whenever you worshiped in those feasts, it was always had a component of sacrifice that involved a prescription of animals. And so what developed, and it's not bad, what developed were changing stations. For instance, if Linda's coming from Jericho and she's going down or going up to Jerusalem, and she needs, it would be easier for her to go and buy the bull there and then sacrifice than it would be for her and her family to pull the bull all the way from Jericho to Jerusalem, right? Because sacrifice was a really serious business. You did not play with that.
And there had to be unblemished.
That's right. So you couldn't.
Came with something.
Right. Well, and if it's unblemished when you leave, and it ends up, breaking a leg, you got to go back. What developed, and it's sanctioned, it's okay, was we want people to worship. That's a good thing. We want to make it easy for them. And so throughout what's developed by this time are these places where during the feast where people could worship because they needed a certain prescription. And now what's interesting here is that it's not outside the temple when in its origin it was. what has happened, it's moved now inside of the temple. And so that could be while Jesus is upset.
My Bible says that that's the reason he was upset, because it was going on in the one place that the Gentiles could worship.
Right. Well, then your Bible has just robbed us of about 20 minutes. So if y'all want to take a break and then call it quits, we have our answer, and stand for the benediction. So so let's see where the Bible got to where it is. You know, it could be, even though we might know what the answer is, let's just assume that we don't, that the object of displeasure for Jesus was that what we have are street vendors. Some of you traveled with me. We went to Italy this past summer. And have you ever been to Pisa? Leaning Tower of Pisa? I have to tell you, I was really thankful to see that once I got there. But you got to pass through all these vendor places, and you know, everybody's hawking whatever it is they want to hawk and sell. And you know, when you get to Pisa and you actually get into the little city and you turn, it's got the green grass and the white buildings, and it's, you know, for about 15 minutes it looks really, really good. And then you realize you got to go back through all the street vendors again. And so maybe what Jesus is upset with, pretend Sandy didn't give you the answer, is that Jesus is turning the corner and he wants to go to the temple, but along the way there are all these little people selling these little Jerusalem hats and little miniature Jerusalems that Jesus could put on his refrigerator, and maybe different postcards, and Jesus and his followers are trying to get to the temple, but they just keep getting, you know, they're just being bombarded when all they want to do is go to the temple. So maybe Jesus is upset is because you know, there are all these street vendors who are selling all these religious trinkets, but it really has nothing to do with religion. They're just there to make some money. All right? Maybe that's it. Probably not. But maybe that's what's going on. Someone mentioned making money. Maybe Jesus is upset because what he's witnessing are unfair business practices. Price gouging. You know, so that's exactly right. And it's kind of like when you need gas. Remember when the pump went out, you know, whatever it was, a month or two ago, and you know, and all of a sudden your gas went from like $1.09 to $1.50. I mean, or $2.09 to $2.50. You know, or when it's hurricane, you know, and our major storm coming through, and you know, it goes from $2 to $10 real quick. So maybe what Jesus is upset with is that there's major dishonesty, and people are taking advantage of others, and they are really just have adopted these very unfair and business practices that are sticking it to everybody else. That might be. I don't think you can justify that in the text, because Jesus doesn't, or John the gospel writer doesn't make any, I mean, he doesn't talk about people price gouging. I mean, let's go back and look at the text. Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found that those were selling oxen, sheep, and pigeons, and money changers sitting there. You had to have certain money for temple activity. All right? I mean, there were multiple types of money. It's kind of like if you go to Europe, you got the euro, you got the dollar, you got whatever the local country is. You might be able, you know, some of them still, you know, you can see some of that bouncing around. And but you had to switch money to buy here. So the money changers are serving a purpose, and we don't know if they have adopted unfair practices, or if the people selling the oxen, the sheep, and the pigeons have adopted unfair practices. At least John does not say it. Well, sure. Well, we haven't got to. We do know, because thanks to Christmas coming early. But let's just assume that we did not hear that. We'll go back and delete it. So if you're watching a later version of this, we'll edit that out. Or what we'll do is you have to put, now they do the spoiler alerts. Have you seen that? So spoiler alert, we're going to have the answer here in about 2 seconds. So, but we don't know exactly what it is. It might be some dishonest practices. I would lean to that not being the case because John, the gospel writer, doesn't tell us. And it would make, at least, it would make better sense that if it was this what made him upset, then he would have told us, right? Because when he does talk about, when we get to the second half, and that would be in verse 18, and he talks about the temple. All right, so when he gets into verse 16, you make my father's house a house of trade. Now, trade, it doesn't say unfair trade. It doesn't say dishonest trade. It just says that the house is now used for trade instead of something else. So all that, and then if we look at some other passages in the Synoptics, whether or not this is unfair business practice, I think it requires a little more to draw that conclusion than the conclusion that maybe they had fair practices, that the issue is not that they have these shops, it's the placement of the shops that becomes the issue. So,
But all those animals were in there. I mean, think of all the trash and all that.
well, but that's common in that day. I mean, it's a very, ma'am?
Like you said, it should have been outside the temple.
Well, but when they sacrifice inside the temple. And so, and sacrifice, just so you know, it's not like you went and bought the lamb and somewhere in the back room that you didn't see, they got the nice little rack for you and they brought it out and you buy it and it's wrapped up with a nice little price tag on it. The sacrifice was they took the animal, they slit its throat, and then that was part of the sacrifice. Blood was used in a certain place, and and so when they took out the bowels, the entrails, some of that was used, some of it wasn't. So right,
Those were all things about the law.
right.
Not about worship.
Well, but that was a part of worship.
It
Yeah.
wasn't I guess where I try to boil it down to is, this is my Father's house, this is a place of worship. And, he was trying to tell people you could, I guess the thing is, we know other things from the Bible. So
Right.
when I'm reading this text, I'm thinking, it is, there are people that he has at the well that worship, and they, or people he meets on the road, and, they worship there. It doesn't matter where you are, and you don't have to have sacrifice. All of those things.
But in the temple worship, it involved a sacrifice, and the sacrifice was dirty. That's what my point is, that they didn't clean it up to where, for instance, if anybody in your family hunt, and y'all kill a deer, and you can do two things with it. You can gut it right then, or you can take it and pay somebody to gut it. Well, that's what's going on here. They gutted the animal. And so the idea that people, it would be common in that day for people to have witnessed that. It's gory. But that was a part of worship. And in that particular day. Now, just hang on, stay with me. So what we don't know is that if it's unfair business practices or not. I would argue that that's not what John, the gospel writer, is getting at. And that the idea that Jesus is putting an end to the whole sacrificial system as a whole, again, that might be sort of like where you look at the wedding at Cana, and you're making a statement that Jesus is blessing marriage just because he's there. There are other times where John, the gospel writer, addresses the sacrificial system. I don't think that he's doing it here. What John gives us into what got Jesus so upset was that there were people, and this is where what Sandy had mentioned, is that there are places that were good for the group to be able to change their money or to buy whatever it would be that would be used in the sacrifice. But instead of being outside of the temple, it's inside of the temple, and it's inside the temple in a place where people are worshiping. More specifically, they would also go and pray. And so all this is congested, and it is prohibiting people from worshiping. More specifically, Gentiles in that particular case cannot worship because all of this is going on. They cannot. I mean, it's when we went to the Vatican. All right, you ever been to the Vatican? Can you find a seat or a corner where you can just sit there for a while in the Vatican? Not even close. There are gazillions people there, and you're moving like this. All right, it's a lot of that going on. And so what was designed as a place of worship, what was designed as a place for prayer is being consumed by something else. And that is what gets Jesus to the place where He's at. No, go ahead. No, that's fine.
Where was the sacrifice as it should have been practiced? Where was it?
Well, they had a couple of different altars, okay? They have, obviously, the Holy of Holies. That would not have been this one. There's a bronze altar, which would be up, and that was a huge altar, okay? So that thing would have been massive. That, you could have put multiple animals on top. At some point, there were places to give the animal to a temple attendant or whoever it may be, a priest that was on duty, and then they would take the animal in and make the sacrifice.
Because the Gentiles, they could go no further.
That's right. Well, they would have had, God-fearers, okay, in the New Testament, they're God-fearers. They're people who are non-Jewish, but they have adopted Jewish religious practices. And those would be the people here. They would have had people or places, ushers, basically, for lack of better words, to take those things and then move them to, because they wouldn't have sacrificed here. All right, there wasn't an altar there. All right, and they would, the women wouldn't have sacrificed. Right, they would have taken them to certain places in the temple to worship. Now you have a question, and
I guess I'm just thinking, if I didn't know any, I ain't gonna sit here, so I don't know any of it.
that has nothing. That could make it worse, So.
But, okay, so I'm taking exactly as what I see here.
Mhm.
It doesn't, somebody in some other theologian has said, and put the notes in the Bible about, they were taking up space.
Mhm.
But what it says is that you're trading in my Father's house instead of using it for the purpose that it was intended.
Right.
Okay, so I buy then the sacrifice, but you get that somewhere else and you come prepared.
Right.
And that you don't, it isn't about space.
Well, but if all this
It
is
doesn't say it's anything about space, it says it's about the fact that they're focused on something else.
right,
They're
right,
focused on
it's both. So if it's out here, if you change your money and you buy whatever it is here, and then you go into the temple, well, all this is reverent space. And so, and the way you would do the sacrifice, it's you wouldn't do it. So you would, like, if Becky was the attendant, I would take, my animal to Becky, and I would, this is, whatever it would be for my family or whatever the season or the feast would be. Then Becky would take that to either the priests that were on duty or the one, because they serve like shift work. And then they would take that and make the sacrifice. But there were places to give offerings, money. There was also places for places of prayer. And so what was set up for reverent space is now full of everything else. And so what the merchants would have created an environment that would dull the sensitivity towards the needs of others as they sought God in various forms of worship. And so it would be if if you came, maybe the good example would be is if you came on Sunday morning and I put a big old giant TV next to the door, like if you picture our sanctuary, so you got to know a little bit about St. Paul. We have a traditional sanctuary with a chancel, split chancel area where you have the pulpit on one side, lectern on the other side, altar down front, altar table is in the back. It would be as if I set up, I'm going to be up here all day on Sunday, and so I set up over here to the right by the first pew a big screen TV because the Falcons are going to play at 1. And I got the pregame on. All right? And I mean, that's yeah, exactly right. But it's the same type of concept. Would that make it easier for people to worship? No. And so I'm taking that space, which is designed for some level of connection and communion with God, and I'm dulling that, making it hard for people to do that. And so that's what gets Jesus in a place where he pushes them out. Now, what some have argued is that Jesus is also turning the whole sacrificial system on its head, and where he's going to set himself up as the sacrifice for sins. I don't think you can argue that from this particular text. Later on in the gospel we'll look at that, because what happens after Jesus runs them out? Did he post guards? That's exactly right. I mean, the odds are 2 or 3 hours they probably started up again. Yeah. Right. What's the point, though? The point is that this is... Pardon me? Oh, you can tear it down, but it's coming... Oh, you're talking about... Okay. Yeah, you moved on to the temple. Yeah, we are in just after the break. We've got to take a break. Oh, gosh, it's already 11 o'clock. So the point is this is a place that's designed for communion with God, worship, reverence, prayer, and that is not being used for that particular purpose. And he drives them out. It's very symbolic because he doesn't post guards. He leaves after this, and they could easily come back and do it again. So if Jesus was interested in a permanent change of how the temple, and was just staunch on prohibiting all of that, then Jesus would have stood at the door with his belt or the cords or whatever. I mean, he runs them out, but the odds are in probably a few hours they could have came back in and started it again. We just don't know. All right, let's take a break and then we'll come back. How about 5 minutes or so? Quick break. Jesus actually quotes in verse 16 and 17, and he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that. It was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And so the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us?" And now I'm into verse 18. "What sign do you show us?" I have to get where I can see this. "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build the temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of the body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So you got this concept of zeal. And, one of the things that often shows up in this passage, or at least one of the questions that are asked by this is, Jesus makes this whip, a whip of cords, and he drove them all out of the temple. Does that mean that Jesus whipped people, or did he whip the animals, or what does that mean? And then you got this idea of zeal, and there being the presence of very hot emotions, a ton of passion that's assigned to that. And so often people ask, is Jesus just, has he blown his top? Is he just acting out of such anger that he's kind of seeing red? One may read this and see that actually what Jesus is doing is showing restraint. It doesn't seem that anything was lost from this, that there was tons of damage that happened during the incident. The money was not thrown into the crowd or taken away. The doves were not released into the air, or he didn't set the animals free. I mean, obviously Jesus' actions are disruptive, but they're not destructive. And that's a big difference. Someone can be passionate, someone could have a ton of zeal, and someone could even be angry, but not be out of control. And so to read into the text that Jesus was out of control, I think is I think we might are starting with that, and we're trying to find examples so that we could prove what we are reading into the text. I'm not sure you can get out of the text that Jesus was out of control. Obviously, we talked about his motivation, that this is a symbolic clearing of the temple that's directed toward this irrelevant temple practices. Then it would be some actual reform, because if he was after actual reform, there would have been other behavioral things that Jesus would have done, other actions that would have prevented people from coming back in, when what could easily have happened is just a few hours later, they could have set up shop and be doing the same thing again. Now, immediately after this, you've got some of the Jews that are asking him, "What sign? Give us a sign for why you're doing what you're doing." And he does then mention, "Destroy the temple, in 3 days I will raise it up." And of course, for them, there's a conversation about the actual temple itself physically compared to something else that Jesus is talking about, which he's talking about the sign of the resurrection. And so there's a little bit of disagreement on that particular issue when it came to at least his immediate audience. But what's interesting is that when Jesus begins his public ministry, according to John the Gospel writer begins with two different experiences, two different actions. One of them has to do with the wedding of Cana, and then it also has to do with the cleansing of the temple. How might they be connected together? I mean, do you think they happen chronologically together? I mean, maybe. Is there a theme that weaves them together? I mean, why, if you're writing the gospel, I mean, why would you link a wedding at Cana that Jesus is part of, and then the cleansing of the temple that obviously Jesus is part of? Is there anything that maybe links them together?
In both instances, the end result was that his disciples believed in him.
All right. Well, then if we keep on reading in 23, we get into this idea of believing in the name. If you look at 23, now that when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. Well, we have two signs, right? You have the sign of, or what's going on at the wedding of Cana, and then you also got this thing that's going on inside the temple. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about a man. And then notice this last little part. For he himself knew he was in, what does it say? He was in man. That's got to be he knew that what was in man. Excuse me. Yeah. I tell you, my eyesight. I'm living into a different day where multiple glasses, and even when I wear contacts, and it's just not very fun. I'll tell you that much. I have to hold it way out here to see it, and Oh, I know it. Listen, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but from someone who's just now moving into this day and time, and my grandmother, bless her heart, boy, she had some glasses that were like magnifying glasses, and I think I'm leading out. It's not too far. My children are getting on to me because I can't see anymore and I can't hear, and so Connor last night, Connor was in one of our TV rooms, and I went in there and how's your day and all that when I got home, and he was talking. Man, I couldn't hear a word he was saying. And so I kept getting closer to him, like, say that again. He's like, Dad, you're deaf. I was like, well, you're mumbling, He said, I'm not mumbling, So, he said, you need some hearing aids. And I said, yeah, I just want to get 50 before I buy them. It's kind of like, I'm all right with it. Just as long as I can get to that number, I think I'll be okay. Then I have to go see Vaughn. So, all right. So, what we have is, Gene, your question or your comment was that the two things are connected because out of that, there's some level of a sign, and the resulting part of that is some level of belief in some form or fashion. Now, it might not be a full belief, or maybe it's the beginning of that. We don't get an explanation for what was going on, other than the fact that because of all this, people are believing, which is also part of the major theme of the Gospel of John. Remember in chapter 20, and we were just talking about, you have to go back a couple of weeks, but when we first started this study, the whole purpose of John, the Gospel writer, writing his Gospel, we found in chapter 20, was so that he could give evidences so that people who read this would come to faith. And so we've, again, look at the way the Gospel is set up. John 1:1 through 1:18, you have this very wide net that's being cast about all this theology about the Word and light and life and all that, and it gets anchored down into, to Jesus, and then the rest of the Gospel goes out to give just different examples and evidences of what was first said. And so the idea is, he's beginning his public ministry, and so that's one example, two examples. What we're going to find is just piece after piece after piece are all examples that John, the Gospel writer, is presenting to the reader, so that in reading this, it leads to some level of faith in this Word who has become flesh and who is both light and life. And when we get into chapter 3, now chapter 3, we're not going to get into it today, so don't worry. Chapter 3 is a very famous chapter in the Gospel of John. The first part has to deal with who? And what? And what? Being born again, which, what is he talking about? Believing. Right. And so, we have this beginning of public ministry in Wedding of Cana. then the temple, cleaning out of the temple, and then immediately we get into John 3, which is going to be another example about believing. And so this never goes away. I mean, the rest of the gospel, what you'll find are just different examples where people are being exposed to Jesus and how that leads to at least some level of no belief at all, a little bit of belief, or a lot of belief. And just like the other gospels, the ones that you think should see the sign and immediately say, yes, I got it, there's a struggle. And then there are these people who are on the outsides who, by any measure of that day, no one would say they should get it, and yet they do. And so your answer, Gene, is correct. Obviously, you've been reading Sandy's Bible, and you've got the answers there. But what holds them together is that you've got these signs, these examples, and from that, people are believing. And that again, it is all throughout the rest of the gospel. All right? Went through a whole chapter in one day. And we still got 5 minutes. All right, I just want the record to know that we're ending at 5 minutes till. So, that's kind of like if it's when we get out of church, 11:59. It's before noon. It's like, it's so no worries whatsoever. All right, any comments or questions seriously about either? Oh, you're talking about the one from Sunday? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we St. Paul is involved with the Winton Neighborhood Network, and I think many of y'all are aware of that. And that's one of, I think, 8 faith congregations, 8 or 9, I can't remember, and that are in this area that pool resources to be a place of help for those that are in need. And St. Paul is a big supporter of that and have been, for a long time. And then once a year we have a service around Thanksgiving, and this year St. Paul hosted. Thought the choir did a fantastic job, and just a beautiful, beautiful piece that they led. And then Rabbi Short spoke, and she's involved down at the Temple Israel. But everybody had a part to play. So thank you for those that helped make that a reality. Next year, I think Sheriff Israel is hosting. And either myself or John, most likely me, will be speaking. So, all right. Any other comments, questions about the text or anything else? Go in peace.